I wanted to talk today about history and the writing of history, and about Felipe Guama and Poma de Ayala and the indigenous perspective on the conquest. There's a distinction between history in terms of what happened in the past and the writing of history. In other words, the representation or the recording or the accounting of what happened in the past. The writing of history is inevitably selective. It involves a series of judgments as to what is important, what counts. History, in the second sense, is a concept that we see, for instance, in the notion that such and such an event will go down in history. That's a recognition that not everything is given the same emphasis in records of the past. It's a question of picking what seem to be key moments or key points or key events or key personalities, pushing others to the margin in order to construct a narrative, to construct ideas of linear causality, to construct ideas of influence. There's always a gap between what happened and the records made of what happened. There's always some kind of slippage in representation. There's never such a thing as a full reconstruction of the historical record. Representation never fully aligns with the real. The question then is who gets to decide and how as to what counts, as to what is important, as to which stories get told and which stories don't even make it as stories. On the whole, these decisions are made by those who have access to the dominant technology of the moment. Those who have access to those dominant technologies of representation are those who are in power. It's both an effect of their power, that they have that access, that they have that privileged access to such technologies, and having that access helps to perpetuate their positions of power. It's sometimes said that history is written by the victors. A subsequent question then is what to do about this? Well, there are at least two possible alternatives. One is to read dominant narratives against the grain. We look for their slippages, their limits, their blind spots, their gaps. We look at the ways in which they reveal the limitations of representation. We look at the ways in which they evade or elide or push certain stories to the margins, and often we can read those symptoms of power at work in the text themselves. There is another way, of course, of approaching this problem of the gap between representation and reality, the way in which the writing of history fails in some way to live up to history, and that's to seek out other sources, other voices, other perspectives. Note that we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that we'll ever get a full account of the past. Any representation is going to be partial in one way or another. Still, that doesn't mean it's not worth trying to find other perspectives and other viewpoints. And perhaps that means sometimes rethinking what counts as a document, to look, for instance, at oral history as opposed to written history. When it comes to the Americas and the conquest of the Americas, there are very few accounts of what happened from the perspectives of those conquered, from the perspectives of the indigenous. That's for many different reasons, partly because of the sheer violence of what took place, which eliminated so much of the indigenous population, but it's also because of a difference or a differential access to the particular technology that soon became dominant, which was the written word. In pre-conquest Americas, though you had a number of very sophisticated cultures and civilizations, none of them had alphabetical writing. They had other means to record the past, to record what seemed to them significant. For instance, you had the codices amongst the Aztec or the Mexica. You had hieroglyphics amongst the Maya of Central America. In the Andes, in the Inca Empire, you had a system of knotted ropes, bundled knotted ropes, which were a form of accounting called quipu. For the Europeans, this difference was perceived as a lack, was perceived as a marker of European civilization and distinction against supposed indigenous backwardness or barbarism. But this is not simply a matter of the conquest alone. The indigenous continue to have less access to the dominant mode of representation, less access to writing, or less likely to be given the forms of education to allow for literacy right into the 20th century and even to today. Felipe Guama Poma de Ayala is both exception and proof of this rule. He is an exception in that he does write. He writes this extraordinary document, of which we've read a very small part, a letter to the king of Spain, Felipe III, that's almost 1,200 pages long. It is, amongst other things, an account of many aspects of indigenous culture, tradition, beliefs, everyday life. It is also a petition to the king. It is an attempt to seek legal redress against abuses within the colonies, an appeal, as it were, over the heads of the conquistadors to the ultimate authority, the king. And he provides an indigenous voice, an indigenous point of view on the conquest and on colonization. What stands out, as you have seen, is this sense of the stupefying greed for gold and silver and precious metals. A greed that seems almost beyond belief. Each day they did nothing but think of the gold and silver and riches of the Indies of Peru. What are the Spaniards doing with all this gold? Do they eat it? With their greed and gold for silver, they go to hell. Now that mention of hell in itself also should be a warning against treating this text as a kind of pure voice of native thought and civilization. This is a hybrid text. It's a hybrid text in many different ways. It's a hybrid text because it mixes Spanish and Quechua. It's written in Spanish, so that it could be read, so that it could be legible to the King of Spain. It also combines images, pictures, hand-drawn line drawings with alphabetical text. It combines indigenous beliefs and indigenous traditions with Catholicism, with an acceptance of Catholic beliefs. The very notion that the Spaniards were going to hell is an adoption of a Spanish Catholic worldview. Indeed, by addressing the King of Spain in this way, it's an acknowledgement of sovereignty, the realpolitik, as it were, of colonialism. In some ways, this hybridity is the price paid for legibility. These are the concessions that someone like Guama and Poma would have to make for their voice to be heard. There's a famous phrase by a post-colonial theorist that says that the subaltern cannot speak. It's not so much perhaps that the subaltern cannot speak, but the subaltern cannot be heard unless he or she adopts at least some of the technology of representation of those in power, of the dominant. Even so, despite these concessions, despite these attempts to make his point of view, his perspective legible in Spain and to the Spaniards, this is a text that essentially wasn't read, that proved illegible and was lost until it turned up in the Danish Royal Library in 1908. I want to talk about one incident that Guama Poma relays, which is also an allegory perhaps for the process of conquest and of colonization, for the breach between perspectives. This is the incident of Cajamarca, in which in 1532 Francisco Pizarro and a couple of hundred fellow adventurers, conquistadors, meets the Inca Atahualpa, meets the supreme power of the Inca Empire in what is now northern Peru. Famously in this encounter, a friar comes forward, Vicente de Valverde, and he has with him a book, a Bible or a missal, and he presents it to Atahualpa, saying, "This is the word of God." And the Inca peruses it for a while, and as Guama Poma tells us, there's a sudden bemusement or misunderstanding here. The Inca says, "This book doesn't even talk to me," and he throws it down to the ground. For the Spaniards, this is the justification for conquest. This is the proof of blasphemy, and this is the proof that they're dealing with infidels. This is the proof that they're not dealing with equals. But it's perhaps best seen as an allegory of the missed encounter that is at the heart of the conquest, of a clash between modes of representation, between a predominantly oral culture and a culture that sees itself as a culture of the book, of the religious book. The irony, of course, is that most of Pizarro's men wouldn't have been able to read this book either. It was a text that was in Latin, most likely. It was a text that was seen as a fetish. But it was a fetish to the Spaniards that seemed to justify the colonial enterprise. So Valverde shouts out, "Out, knights, against these infidels, let us have at them." So we've already begun to see, for instance, through Columbus's texts written to the King and Queen of Spain, how the conquest and colonization is a process mediated through the written word. And over the course of the colonial enterprise, those who had a particular facility with the written word, scribes and priests for instance, so-called letrados, the people of the letter, had a significant position in the hierarchy of colonial power. But we also see the limits of that mediation. We see the way in which that mediation fails, as is allegorized in the incident Cajamarca. The breach between the lettered and the unlettered is ultimately a breach for which there's no mediation.